July 7, 1968, Harlem. Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue. The kind of place that has been feeding Harlem since before most of the people eating there were born fried chicken. Waffles, sweet potato pie, the smell of hot grease and coffee, and something older underneath it all. The particular warmth of a neighborhood institution that has survived everything the city has thrown at it. It is a Sunday evening. The tables are full. The noise is the noise of people who are comfortable, who are among their own, who have nowhere urgent to be. At a corner table in the back, the way he always sits, back to the wall, eyes on the door, the habit of 40 years of being a man that other men want to find before he finds them, sits Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He is 62 years old. He has been the most powerful figure in Harlem's underworld since the 1930s. He has been to prison 3 times and come back each time with his reputation not just intact but larger, the way certain men seem to grow in the telling, even when the telling includes their lowest moments. He has survived assassinations, federal investigations, wars with the Italian families, the particular slow grind of a system designed to destroy men like him. He is eating. He is talking. He is, by every visible indicator, a man who intends to be here for a long time yet. He is wrong about that. Across the table, watching him the way he always watches, quietly, completely, missing nothing, is Frank Lucas. Frank is 33 years old. He has been by Bumpy's side for years, long enough that people in Harlem have stopped thinking of him as a separate person and started thinking of him as an extension of Bumpy, the shadow, the driver, the right hand, the errand boy who is clearly something more than an errand boy, but whose exact nature nobody has quite been able to define. Frank knows what he is. He has always known. He has been watching Bumpy Johnson operate at the highest level of a world that has no mercy and no sentiment and no second chances for going on a decade. And what he has learned in that time is not just the mechanics of the business, but something deeper, the philosophy underneath, the specific way that a man who intends to last thinks about power and patience, and the difference between what people see and what is actually there. Bumpy has been teaching Frank all of this, not in classrooms, not with lectures, the way real education works in that world, by proximity, by example, by letting a man watch and trusting him to understand what he is watching. Frank has understood everything. And on this particular Sunday evening in July 1968, watching Bumpy eat his chicken and hold court and laugh at something somebody 3 tables over just said, Frank does not yet know that he is watching the last night of the most important education of his life. Nobody knows. That is the thing about the last time. It never announces itself. It just arrives, quiet and final, and you understand what it was only after it is already gone. Bumpy Johnson put down his fork at approximately 9:45 in the evening. The people who were there later described it different ways. Some said he reached for his water glass and missed it. Some said he simply stopped moving mid-sentence. Some said he made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite anything else. What everyone agreed on was the speed of it. One moment Bumpy Johnson was there, fully present, filling the room the way he always filled rooms, with weight, with history, with the specific gravity of a man who has survived everything, and then he was somewhere else entirely. His body still in the chair, but whatever had made it, Bumpy Johnson already leaving. Frank was out of his seat before anyone else moved. He reached Bumpy in the time it takes to cross a small room, which is no time at all. And he did what you do when someone you have spent years watching and learning from and caring for in the specific way that men in that world care for each other, without sentimentality, without display, with the quiet practical urgency of someone for whom this person's continued existence is not optional. He held him. That is the word people used who saw it. Frank Lucas held Bumpy Johnson while the ambulance was called, and the room went from noise to silence to a different kind of noise. The noise of people who understand that something has ended and do not yet know what comes next. Bumpy Johnson died before the ambulance arrived. He died at Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem on the evening of July 7th, 1968, with Frank Lucas beside him. And in the minutes between, when Bumpy's body began to fail and when it stopped. Entirely, in that specific and terrible window of time that the people who have been in rooms like that describe as both very fast and very slow. Simultaneously, something passed between them. This is the part that history does not record cleanly. This is the part that depends on who you ask and when you ask them and how much they are willing to say. But the people who knew Frank Lucas, who knew him before that night and watched him after it, describe a change that is not subtle, not in his personality, which was always what it was, not in his manner, which was always controlled and quiet and several degrees colder than the room around him, but in something underneath all of that, in the specific quality of his certainty, as if something that had been building for years suddenly had a foundation it had not had before, as if Bumpy Johnson, in the last minutes of his life, had handed Frank something that Frank had been preparing to receive for a very long time. What was said in those minutes, nobody knows completely. Frank Lucas, who over the years gave interviews and told his story in pieces to journalists and filmmakers and federal prosecutors, spoke about Bumpy's death many times. He spoke about the grief of it, which was real, which was the grief of a man who had lost the closest thing he had to a father in the world he actually inhabited. He spoke about the silence of the restaurant and the sound of the ambulance that arrived too late and the faces of the people around them, but about what passed between them in those final minutes, about what be said, if anything, or what his eyes communicated in the moments before they closed. Frank Lucas was always careful, not evasive, careful, the way a man is careful about something that belongs to him completely and that he has decided does not need to be shared with the world that didn't earn it. What we know is this: Bumpy Johnson had spent decades understanding something about Harlem and about power that almost nobody else understood at the same level. He had watched the Italian families move into the city's narcotics trade and understood that fighting them directly was a losing proposition. He had built instead a series of arrangements, careful, pragmatic, based on the recognition that power in his world was never absolute, and that the men who lasted were the ones who knew which battles to fight and which to navigate around. He had survived by being smarter than the people who wanted to destroy him and more patient than the people who wanted to take what he had. He had taught Frank Lucas over years to see the world the same way. And Bumpy Johnson, who was not a sentimental man and who did not waste words, would have known in those final minutes, the way men who have spent their lives reading situations know things, that Frank Lucas was the only person in his world who was ready for what came next. What came next was everything. The vacuum Bumpy left behind was the most dangerous opportunity in Harlem in a generation. Every player in the city's underworld was going to move for it. The Italian families were going to push. The existing Harlem operators were going to scramble. And Frank Lucas, sitting in that restaurant, holding the man who had taught him everything while the life went out of him, was going to have to decide, in the days and weeks that followed, who he was going to be. The decision had already been made. That is the other thing the people who knew Frank said about the change they saw after that night. Not that he became something new, but that he became something complete, as if the last piece of whatever Frank Lucas had been put in place in that corner table at Wells Restaurant, and what walked out of there was no longer a man in formation, but a man arrived. 3 weeks after Bumpy Johnson's funeral, Frank Lucas left for Thailand. He came back with Blue Magic to 98% pure heroin, a product so far beyond anything else, available in New York, that it functioned less like competition and more like a redefinition of the category. Within 6 months, he was generating $1 million a day. Within a year, the Italian families were reassessing everything they thought they knew about who held power in Harlem. Within 5 years, Frank Lucas had built an operation so sophisticated that the DEA, when they finally understood what they were looking at, described it as unlike anything they had encountered before. None of this came from nowhere. It came from a decade of watching Bumpy Johnson operate. It came from understanding, at a level that most men in that world never reach, that the game is not about force, but about information. Not about reaction, but about calculation. Not about being the loudest person in the room, but about being the one who understands the room most completely. It came from everything Bumpy taught, everything Frank absorbed, everything that was built in the years of proximity and observation, and the specific education that only comes from watching a master work. And it came from whatever passed between them in those final minutes at Wells' restaurant. The thing that Frank Lucas carried out of that room and never fully explained. The thing that Harlem felt in the months that followed, in the appearance of blue magic, in the precision and discipline of Frank's operation, in the specific quality of his certainty that seemed to have no bottom to it, no moment where it wavered or broke or showed itself to be performance rather than substance. Bumpy Johnson died at Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue on July 7, 1968. He was 62 years old. He left behind a Harlem that was about to change in ways that even he, who had seen everything this city could produce, might not have fully anticipated. He left behind a man who had been watching him for years and learning everything and waiting, with the patience that Bumpy himself had taught, for the moment when all of that watching and learning would become something. He left behind Frank Lucas, and Frank Lucas, who had been many things in the years of his apprenticeship, the driver, the shadow, the right hand, the errand boy who was clearly something more, walked out of Wells' restaurant on the evening of July 7, 1968, and was none of those things anymore. What he was, Harlem was about to find out. The Italian families were about to find out. The DEA was going to spend 7 years finding out. And on September 12, 1968, 67 days after Bumpy Johnson died, 67 days after whatever passed between them in that corner table, Frank Lucas crossed 116th Street in broad daylight, in front of 300 people, and showed the first of what he had become. 4 shots. The body on the sidewalk. The money counted over it. The lunch finished. 300 witnesses. Not one description. That was the announcement. But the education that made the announcement possible, the years of watching, the decade of learning, the specific thing that passed in the last minutes at Wells' restaurant, that was Bumpy Johnson's final gift to the man he had been building for years without ever quite saying that is what he was doing. Legends don't announce their intentions. They work, they teach, and when the time comes, they hand something to the person who has been ready to receive it for longer than either of them has admitted. Bumpy Johnson leaned into Frank Lucas's ear before he died. What he said, Frank Lucas never fully told. But Harlem heard the answer 67 days later, and New York has been talking about it ever since. This is the story that connects everything. Not the shooting on 116th Street, not the Nagra recorder, not the Vietnam coffins, not the D-raid, not the cooperation agreement that brought down 100 corrupt officers. All of those things are chapters. This, the corner table at Wells' restaurant, the Sunday evening in July, the final minutes of the most important teacher Frank Lucas ever had, this is the first page. You cannot understand Frank Lucas without understanding Bumpy Johnson. You cannot understand Bumpy Johnson without understanding what he built in Frank Lucas over the years of their proximity. And you cannot understand what Frank Lucas became without understanding that whatever it was completed in that room. Not created, completed. Frank Lucas was already Frank Lucas. Bumpy Johnson just made sure he knew it. And on the evening of July 7th, 1968, with the ambulance on its way, and the restaurant gone silent, and the years of watching and learning reaching their final moment, Bumpy Johnson leaned close to the man who had been by his side and said the thing that needed to be said, the thing that Frank had been ready to hear for longer than he had admitted even to himself. And then Bumpy Johnson closed his eyes, and Frank Lucas stood up, and Harlem was never the same again. Whatever was said in those final minutes at Wells' restaurant, whatever Bumpy Johnson gave Frank Lucas in the last moments of his life, the answer is in everything that came after. In the 67 days of preparation, in the Thailand trip and the blue magic and the $1 million a day, in the briefcase and the Nagra recorder and the 50 envelopes, in the 300 witnesses who saw everything and said nothing, in the 7 years of an empire that shouldn't have been possible and was. That is what Bumpy said, not in words that can be quoted or recorded or repeated in a room, in the shape of everything that followed, in the specific form that Frank Lucas's life took after the night at Wells' restaurant, which is the only form that matters and the only translation that is ever entirely accurate. Bumpy Johnson leaned into Frank Lucas's ear before he died, and everything that came after was the answer dot to understand the full weight of what passed between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas at Wells' restaurant on the evening of July 7th, 1968. You have to understand who Bumpy Johnson actually was. Not the legend. The legend is easy to find, and like all legends, it is both true and insufficient. Not the movie version, not the television version, not the version that gets cleaned up for consumption by audiences who want the excitement without the complexity. The real Bumpy Johnson. Because the real Bumpy Johnson is the only version that explains why Frank Lucas, of all the men who passed through Bumpy's orbit in 40 years of operating at the top of Harlem's underground economy, was the one who received whatever it was that Bumpy gave in those final minutes. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905. He came to Harlem as a teenager during the Great Migration, part of the massive movement of Black Americans, from the South to the cities of the North that reshaped the geography of black life in America across the first half of the 20th century. He arrived with nothing. He was small, physically small, not the imposing figure that the legend sometimes suggests, and he was in a city that had no particular interest in making room for him. What he had was intelligence, the specific, practical, street-level intelligence that comes not from schools, but from paying close attention to how the world actually works and being willing to act on what you learn. He found his way into the numbers racket, which in Harlem in the 1920s and 30s was the financial infrastructure of the community, a lottery system that operated entirely outside the law, and that generated enormous revenue for the men who controlled it. He rose. He survived. He went to prison the first time in 1932, came back, built again. He went again, came back again, built again. Each time the thing he built was more sophisticated than the one before it, because Bumpy Johnson was a man who used every experience, including the worst ones, as information. Prison taught him about patience, about how men behave when all the performance is stripped away, about what people are actually made of when the circumstances stop being comfortable. It also taught him something that very few men in his world learned at any point in their careers, that the most dangerous person in any conflict is not the most violent one, but the most patient one, the one who can wait, the one who does not need to establish dominance in every room on every day, but can instead hold their understanding of a situation quietly and completely until the exact moment when acting on it will be most effective. This is what Bumpy Johnson did. And this is what Bumpy Johnson taught Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas arrived in New York from Greensboro, North Carolina, in the mid-1950s. He was in his early 20s. He had already survived things that most people in the world he was entering had not survived. And he had the particular quality that Bumpy Johnson spent his life identifying in young men, not toughness, which is common and often fatal, but the specific combination of intelligence and discipline and patience that produces men who last. Bumpy found Frank, or Frank found Bumpy. The versions of this story are different depending on who is telling it. But what everyone agrees on is that the connection was immediate and that it was not the connection of employer and employer or boss and soldier, but something older and more structural than that. Bumpy saw in Frank Lucas what he had always been looking for, someone who could take what he knew and carry it forward. Not just the business, not just the territory, not just the relationships and the arrangements and the carefully maintained infrastructure of 4 decades of survival at the top of a world that destroys most of the men who enter it. All of that, but also the philosophy underneath it. The specific way of seeing and thinking and operating that had kept Bumpy Johnson alive and functioning when most of the men he started with were dead or imprisoned or broken. Frank Lucas absorbed it. Everything. He absorbed it the way a person absorbs things that they have been unconsciously preparing to receive. Quickly, completely, with a depth of understanding that surprised even Bumpy, who did not surprise easily. He absorbed the surveillance habits, the discipline of watching before moving, the patience of a man who can sit in a parked car in a janitor's uniform for 3 weeks before he acts. He absorbed the philosophy of power, that real power does not announce itself, that the men who last are never the loudest ones in the room, that being understood is more durable than being feared. He absorbed the business intelligence, the understanding of supply chains and distribution, and the specific vulnerabilities of every competitor and every law enforcement approach. He absorbed all of it, and he held it in the specific way that Frank Lucas held everything, quietly, completely, without display, available when needed and invisible until then. By the time they arrived at Wells Restaurant on the evening of July 7, 1968, Frank Lucas had been receiving this education for years. He was 33 years old. He was ready. He had been ready for longer than either of them had explicitly acknowledged, because Bumpy Johnson was not a sentimental man, and Frank Lucas was not a man who needed to be told things he already knew. What neither of them knew, sitting down to dinner on that Sunday evening, was that the time for the acknowledgement had arrived, whether they were ready for it or not. Bumpy Johnson had survived prison, survived assassination attempts, survived the Dutch-Schultz War, survived the Luciano arrangement, survived federal investigations and state investigations and every form of law enforcement pressure that the American government could bring to bear on a black man, operating outside the law in New York, city in the middle of the 20th century. He had not survived being 62 years old with a heart that had been stressed by 40 years of the specific physical and psychological demands of the life he had lived. The heart attack, when it came the way heart attacks come, without warning, without ceremony, without any of the dramatic signals that the movies give them. One moment Bumpy Johnson was at his table in the back of Wells Restaurant with his back to the wall and his eyes on the door. The next moment he was somewhere else. What happened in between, in the specific window of time that the medical people who study these things describe as the period before full cardiac arrest, when consciousness is still present, but the body is already failing, is the part of this story that belongs to Frank Lucas alone. Frank was beside him immediately. The people who witnessed it said that later, how fast Frank moved, how completely he was present, how there was no hesitation between the moment he understood what was happening and the moment he was there. He held Bumpy. He spoke to him. What was said in both directions? In those minutes, the words that Bumpy Johnson produced in the last functioning moments of his extraordinary mind, the words that Frank Lucas said to the man who had made him what he was, exists only in Frank Lucas's memory and in whatever it is that passes between two people in moments like that, which does not require words at all. What we know is that Frank Lucas left Wells' restaurant that night a different man. Not different in the sense of transformed. Frank Lucas was always Frank Lucas, and the qualities that made him who he was had been forming for his entire life, and could not be given or taken by any single moment. Different in the sense of completed. The sense of a man who has received the last thing he needed and now has everything he requires for what comes next. 67 days later, he was in Thailand. He had gone directly from Bumpy Johnson's funeral arrangements, the quiet, controlled grief of a man who does not perform his emotions, to the planning of something that nobody in New York's narcotics trade had attempted before, a direct relationship with the source. Not through the Italian families, not through the existing supply chain that extracted tribute at every level, not through any of the arrangements that kept black operators dependent on the goodwill of men who regarded them as useful, but never as equals. A direct relationship with the producers in Southeast Asia that would allow him to bring product to New York at a purity and a price that would make everything else on the market irrelevant. Blue magic was born in that planning. It was born in the 67 days between Wells' restaurant and Thailand, in the specific urgency of a man who has received everything he needs and knows that the window for using it will not be open forever. And it was born in the years of education that preceded it, in every morning spent watching from inside Nellie Bell, every conversation absorbed while appearing to be merely present, every lesson about patience and calculation and the specific geometry of power that Bumpy Johnson had been teaching, in his indirect and exacting way, for as long as Frank Lucas had been there to learn. The question that has followed this story since Bumpy Johnson closed his eyes at Wells' restaurant on July 7, 1968, is the same question that Frank Lucas was always careful about answering completely. What did Bumpy say? What were the words, if there were words, that passed from the teacher to the student in the last minutes of the teacher's life? The honest answer is that nobody knows except Frank Lucas and Frank Lucas, who talked about most things with the directness that the journalists and prosecutors and filmmakers who recorded his story consistently remarked on, was always careful about this particular question. He talked around it. He talked about Bumpy's influence, about the years of learning, about the specific things Bumpy understood about power and patience that most men in their world never grasped. He talked about the grief of that night and the weight of it and the particular quality of loss that comes from the death of someone who was not just a person you cared about, but the architecture of who you became. He talked about everything except the specific content of those final minutes, which is, if you understand how Frank Lucas thought about things, itself an answer. Frank Lucas did not protect things because they were unimportant. He protected things because they were entirely his, and he had decided they did not belong to the world that hadn't earned them. Whatever Bumpy said, whatever the final communication was, between the man who had built an understanding of power across 40 years and the man he had spent years preparing to carry it forward, Frank Lucas decided that it was not for public consumption. Not because it was a secret in the conventional sense, but because some things belong to the people who were in the room, and the rest of the world gets to understand them only through their effects. The effects, in this case, are everything that came after July 7, 1968, everything that Frank Lucas built, and how he built it, and the specific philosophy that animated every decision. The surveillance from Nellie Bell, the precision of the tango calculation, the audacity of the Thailand trip and the blue magic operation, the briefcase and the Nagra recorder and the 50 envelopes and the 5 bosses who left the Linux Lounge in silence. The Vietnam coffins. The 7 years and the $400 million and the D-raid and the cooperation agreement that brought down 100 corrupt officers. All of it. Every single thing that Frank Lucas did in the 7 years between Bumpy Johnson's death and his own arrest is the answer to the question of what was said at Wells' restaurant. The answer is not a sentence or a speech or a final piece of wisdom delivered dramatically in a moment of cinematic clarity. The answer is an empire. The answer is a man who walked out of a restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem in July 1968, knowing exactly what he was and what he was going to do and how he was going to do it, and who spent the next 7 years proving that the education he had received was the most complete and most practical and most effective education in the history of the world he inhabited. Bumpy Johnson leaned into Frank Lucas's ear before he died, and what he said is everything that Frank Lucas did afterward. That is the only translation that matters. That is the only version of the story that is entirely true. And if you want to know what was in those final words, if you want to understand the specific content of the last communication between the greatest Harlem operator of one generation and the greatest Harlem operator of the next, you already know it. You have always known it. You just had to understand that it was never going to be in words. It was always going to be in what came after. Gangsters react. Legends calculate. Bumpy Johnson spent 40 years calculating. And in his final minutes, he made one last calculation, the most important one. He looked at the man beside him, the man he had been building for years without ever saying that is what he was doing. And he gave him the last thing he needed. Not information, not instructions, not a plan or a strategy or a piece of intelligence about the landscape that was about to change. Something simpler than all of that and more durable than any of it. Permission. The permission that every man who has been trained by a master and who knows he is ready needs to receive before he can fully become what he already is. The permission to stop being the driver. The permission to stop being the shadow and the right hand and the errand boy who is clearly something more. The permission to be Frank Lucas. That is what Bumpy Johnson said. That is what changed everything. And 67 days later, on a hot Thursday afternoon in September 1968, on a sidewalk on 116th Street in front of 300 people who would see everything and say nothing, Frank Lucas used it. There is a photograph that exists from Bumpy Johnson's funeral. It was taken at the funeral home on 7th Avenue, 3 days after the night at Wells' restaurant. The room is full. Harlem turned out for Bumpy Johnson the way Harlem turns out for its own, with the specific mixture of grief and ceremony and political awareness that characterizes the public mourning of a man who was many things to many different people. There are politicians in the photograph. There are community figures. There are men whose presence in that room, if studied carefully by the right law enforcement personnel, would have produced a significant amount of useful intelligence. And in the back of the room, against the wall, in the position that Frank Lucas always occupied in any room that was primarily Bumpy's, not the center, not the front, but the position of maximum observation and minimum visibility, is Frank Lucas. His face in that photograph is the face of a man who is present and controlled and showing nothing that he does not intend to show, which, for anyone who knew Frank Lucas, means he is showing nothing at all. But the people who knew him well, who were in that room and who looked at him during those hours, not at the photograph taken later, but at the man in real time, described something in his posture that was different from what they had seen before. Not grief, though the grief was real. Not anger. Not the particular restlessness of a man who is suddenly without direction. Something they struggled to articulate precisely, because it was not dramatic and it was not visible in any conventional sense. But it was there. The best description came from a man who had known both Bumpy and Frank for years and who was in the funeral home that day. He said, "Frank looked like a man who has just been given a very large and very heavy thing to carry, and who has decided that he is going to carry it and is already calculating the best way to do so. Not burdened, not excited, just decided." That is the word he used, decided. Frank Lucas, at Bumpy Johnson's funeral, looked decided. Within 24 hours of the funeral, Frank Lucas had begun making calls. The calls were quiet. The way everything Frank did was quiet. No announcements, no declarations, no performance of the ambition that everyone who was paying attention already understood was there. He was reaching out to contacts, building towards something. The specific shape of what he was building was not yet visible to the people around him, but the quality of the building was recognizable to anyone who had watched Frank Lucas long enough, methodical, patient, several steps ahead of where the visible action was happening. By the time he left for Thailand 3 weeks later, the foundation was already laid. He had studied the landscape of New York's narcotics trade with the specific attention of a man who was about to enter it as a principal rather than as a supporting figure. And he had identified the single most important structural weakness in the entire system, the dependency of every black operator in the city on Italian family supply chains that extracted tribute at every level, and that could be turned off whenever the families found it advantageous to do so. The way to destroy that dependency was to go around it entirely. Go to the source. Build a supply chain that the families did not control and could not interrupt. Bring product of a quality so far beyond what was currently available that the market would reorganize itself around it. This was not a new idea in the abstract, but in the specific conditions of New York in 1968, with the Italian families in their dominant position and the existing arrangements functioning well enough to discourage disruption. It was an idea that required a particular combination of vision, resources, courage, and the absolute certainty that the thing could be done. Frank Lucas had all four. He had the vision from years of watching Bumpy navigate the landscape and understanding its structures better than most of its participants. He had the resources from his years as Bumpy's right hand, which had given him access to capital and to connections that most men in his position would not have had. He had the courage that September 12, 1968, would demonstrate to the entire underworld of New York, and the certainty, the specific, grounded, unshakable certainty that is not bravado but architecture, he had received in its final, completed form on the evening of July 7, 1968, in the back corner of Wells Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem. The relationship between Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas is, in the end, the relationship between every great teacher and every great student who takes what the teacher built and carries it further than the teacher went. It is a relationship that requires specific things from both parties. From the teacher, it requires the discipline to give the student what the student needs rather than what would keep the student dependent. Bumpy Johnson could have kept Frank Lucas useful and subordinate. Many men in this position would have, because the most natural human response to having built something is to protect it by keeping the people who could threaten it close and controlled. Bumpy did not do that. He taught. He gave. He prepared Frank Lucas for a world in which Bumpy Johnson no longer existed, and Frank Lucas would have to navigate it alone, which is the most generous thing a teacher can do, and also the most difficult. From the student, it requires the discipline to receive what is being given and hold it completely without acting on it prematurely. Frank Lucas waited. He was 33 years old, and he had been at Bumpy Johnson's side for years, and he was, by any objective assessment, ready to be what he eventually became years before he became it. He waited anyway, not because he was told to, because he understood from watching Bumpy, from absorbing everything Bumpy taught him. That timing is not a separate factor from preparation, but the final form that preparation takes. The right action at the wrong time is still a mistake. Frank Lucas did not make that mistake. He waited until the moment was right, which is to say, he waited until Bumpy Johnson's death made the moment not just right, but necessary. And then he moved. Not with the frantic energy of a man who has been waiting too long, and finally has his chance. With the quiet, methodical, deliberate pace of a man who has been ready for this exact moment, and is now simply executing the plan that the preparation made possible. That is the story that Wells' Restaurant contains. Not just the grief of a Sunday evening in July, not just the final minutes of an extraordinary life, but the specific and irreplaceable transfer that happened in those minutes, the completion of an education that had been in progress for years, the delivery of the last piece of whatever Frank Lucas needed to become what he already was. Bumpy Johnson spent 40 years building his understanding of power in Harlem. He spent the last years of his life transferring it to the one man he trusted to carry it forward. And in his final minutes, at a corner table in a restaurant he had been eating at for years, he gave the last of it. Whatever he said, however he said it, in words or in the specific quality of a look between two men who have spent years not needing words to communicate the things that matter. He gave it, and Frank Lucas received it, and stood up, and walked out of Wells' Restaurant on 7th Avenue in Harlem on the evening of July 7th, 1968, and became, in the 67 days that followed, the man that everything afterward would remember. The king that Harlem did not yet know it was about to have. The storm that Bumpy Johnson had spent years preparing to send. Now, if this story showed you something you did not know, if the connection between Bumpy Johnson's last night and everything Frank Lucas built afterward hit different than you expected, subscribe right now. Because next week, we are going inside the operation that made all of it possible. The Vietnam coffins. The heroine inside the sealed caskets of American soldiers coming home from the war. The supply chain that the D refused to believe was real until they had no choice. The most audacious logistics operation in the history of the American drug trade, and how it was conceived in the 67 days between Wells' Restaurant and Thailand. Turn on notifications. Drop a comment. Was Bumpy Johnson the real architect of Frank Lucas's empire? Because the case for yes is stronger than most people realize. The real story is always darker than you think, and it always starts earlier than you expect. The thing about Bumpy Johnson that most tellings of the Frank Lucas story get wrong, or rather, get incomplete, is the specificity of what he understood. It is easy to say Bumpy was wise. Bumpy was a legend. Bumpy was the godfather of Harlem, who taught Frank everything. Easy and insufficient. What Bumpy Johnson understood, with a precision that came from 40 years of operating in a world that destroyed most of the men who entered it, was the relationship between visibility and vulnerability. The men who lasted in that world were never the most visible ones. They were never the ones who needed the room to go quiet when they walked in, who needed the cars and the clothes and the entourage to communicate their status. Those men were performing. And performance in a world where the audience includes law enforcement and enemies and rivals who are all waiting for you to make a mistake is not a strategy. It is a schedule for your own downfall. Bumpy understood this because he had watched it happen to men who were smarter than him, and tougher than him, and better resourced than him. Men who should have lasted and didn't because they confused the performance of power with power itself. He understood that the men who last are the ones who hold their power internally, who are so certain of what they are and what they can do that they do not need to demonstrate it until the demonstration is necessary, and then demonstrate it so completely that it does not need to be repeated. This understanding is the deepest thing Bumpy Johnson transferred to Frank Lucas, not the business knowledge. though that was real and extensive. Not the connections, though those were invaluable. The specific philosophy, the internal architecture of how a man who intends to last thinks about himself and about power and about the relationship between patience and action. Frank Lucas internalized it so completely that it became indistinguishable from his own nature. The 3 weeks of surveillance from inside Nellie Bell before September 12th, that is Bumpy's philosophy made operational. The 30 minutes of silence at Rouse Restaurant in 1973 while the 5 bosses made their case, that is Bumpy's philosophy. The briefcase and the Nagra and the 50 envelopes, the recognition that information is more durable than force, that is Bumpy's philosophy, taken further than Bumpy ever took it because Frank Lucas had both the foundation Bumpy gave him and the specific conditions of 1968 to 1975. That made new applications of that philosophy possible. And underneath all of it, informing every decision from the first to the last, the certainty. The specific, unshakable, bone-deep certainty that is not arrogance and not performance, but the actual condition of a man who knows what he is and what he can do and has been confirmed in that knowledge by the one person whose confirmation he needed. Bumpy Johnson confirmed it in those final minutes at Wells Restaurant. Not for the first time. He had been confirming it for years, in every lesson, every conversation, every moment of observation shared and knowledge transferred. But finally, completely, in the way that things are confirmed when the person doing the confirming has nothing left to withhold and everything left to give. That is what passed between them in the corner table at Wells Restaurant on the evening of July 7th, 1968. That is what changed. Not Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas was already Frank Lucas. But the last remaining distance between who Frank Lucas was and who he was going to allow himself to be. Bumpy closed that distance in his final minutes. And Frank Lucas walked out of that restaurant and into the rest of his life, into 67 days of preparation and a decade of empire, and a specific legacy that people are still examining more than 50 years later, carrying the last gift his teacher had to give: permission, certainty, the completion of an education. That had been the real work of both their lives for years. Harlem felt it within weeks. The underworld felt it on September 12th. The Italian families felt it in 1973. The D felt it for 7 years before they finally made their case. And Frank Lucas, who carried what Bumpy gave him for the rest of his own long life, who died in 2019 at 88 years old, 51 years after the night at Wells Restaurant, carrying whatever was said in those final minutes to the end, never fully explained it. Because some things do not need to be explained. They only need to be done. And Frank Lucas did them. Every single one. One final thing needs to be said about Bumpy Johnson. About who he was to Harlem. Not to Frank Lucas specifically, but to the neighborhood itself. To the community that produced both of them, and that both of them, in their different ways and by their different methods, shaped. Bumpy Johnson was not simply a criminal. He was not simply a gangster or a mob boss or any of the other reductive categories that the outside world applied to men who operated in Harlem's underground economy in the middle of the 20th century. He was, in the complicated and honest telling of it, something that American cities of that era produced with some regularity. A man who exercised power in the spaces that legitimate institutions refused to occupy. Harlem in the 30s and 40s and 50s was a community that had been systematically excluded from the economic and political structures that were supposed to serve all Americans. The banks that would not lend to black businesses. The unions that would not admit black workers. The political machines that took black votes and gave back nothing of substance. The police departments that protected some people and preyed on others, and understood very clearly which category Harlem fell into. In that landscape, men like Bumpy Johnson filled a vacuum. They provided employment. They provided capital. They provided a form of security, however unofficial and however morally compromised, that the legitimate systems of the city refused to provide. They were also, without question, men whose activities caused serious harm, whose operations fed addiction and violence, and the particular despair of communities consumed by the narcotics trade. Both of these things are true simultaneously. The complexity is not resolvable into a clean verdict. Bumpy Johnson was both of these things at once, in the same way that the communities he operated in were both nurtured and damaged by his presence. Frank Lucas inherited this complexity. He also embodied it more completely than Bumpy had, because the scale of what Frank built meant that the scale of both the benefit and the harm was larger. Blue magic generated revenue that funded legitimate businesses and supported families. Blue magic also destroyed lives at a rate that the sheer purity of the product made worse than anything the market had seen before. This is the part of the Frank Lucas story that the legend tends to elide and that honest examination cannot. He was brilliant. He was disciplined. He was the most strategically sophisticated operator in the history of Harlem's underground economy. He was also responsible for a level of harm in the communities he claimed to care about that compounds over generations and cannot be separated from the admiration that his story otherwise generates. Bumpy Johnson understood this tension. He had lived with it for 40 years. And in the final minutes at Wells' restaurant, in whatever was communicated between them in those last moments, it is reasonable to believe that this was part of what passed between them. Not a resolution of the tension, because there is no resolution, but an acknowledgment of it. The specific acknowledgment that a man who has spent 40 years in the middle of that contradiction owes to the man who is about to enter it at a larger scale than anyone before him. The acknowledgment that what they were building and what they were part of was not simple and was not clean and was not going to be remembered as heroic by everyone who was touched by it, and that they were going to do it anyway, because the world they lived in had given them the choices it had given them, and the choices they made were the choices that made the most sense within the framework of that world, and the responsibility for the framework itself, for the poverty and the exclusion and the structural abandonment. That made the underground economy the most rational option for men of their intelligence and ambition. That responsibility belonged to a system much larger and much older than either of them. They did not create the conditions that produced them. They responded to those conditions with everything they had. And Bumpy Johnson, in his final minutes, passed the response forward to the one man he had spent years preparing to carry it. Frank Lucas received it, stood up, walked out into the Harlem night. And the rest of the story you already know.